Elara, a Havenbrook University student, was among the many students with the highest GPA in campus. 21-year-old Elara Vance. Her dark hair flowed behind her, and her green eyes gleamed with a sense of calm confidence. Elara was like any other university student, or so it seemed. She was a senior majoring in psychology, known for her sharp wit, friendly nature, and her knack for always being in the right place at the right time. But beneath that charming smile and welcoming attitude lay a secret. Elara was a witch. Not a witch in the fairy tale sense, riding broomsticks or casting fireballs. No, Elara practiced an ancient, subtle form of witchcraft passed down through generations in her family. She was careful, never letting anyone see what she was capable of. Her powers, rooted in manipulation of the mind and spirit, allowed her to influence those around her without them ever realizing. It started small at first. A slight nudge here, a whisper there, a suggestion placed carefully in a friend's ear, and soon they would find themselves bending to her will. She wasn't malicious. Elara never wanted to hurt anyone, at least not intentionally. She believed her powers were meant for greater things, to help people, to bring peace and clarity to troubled minds. But power, as it often does, grew addictive. It began with small things, like getting her friends to let her copy their homework, or persuading a professor to give her an extension on an essay. But as the weeks went by, Elara's desires deepened. She craved influence, control. And it was during one particular quiet evening in the library when she got an idea that would change everything. She decided to initiate a few of her close friends and classmates into her secret world of witchcraft. They wouldn't be witches themselves. No, Elara was special. But through careful rituals and the use of enchanted foods, she could bind them to her in ways they would never understand. It started with a dinner party. Elara, always the sociable one, had invited a group of her course mates over to her small apartment for a casual evening of food and drinks. There was Amelia, a bubbly girl from her biology class, Tom, the quiet history major who rarely spoke but always showed up when invited, and Kevin, a charming business student with a knack for making everyone laugh. "You're such an amazing cook, Elara," Amelia said as she took a bite of the warm, fragrant stew Elara had prepared. Elara smiled, her green eyes glinting in the dim light of the room. "Thanks, Amelia. It's an old family recipe." Kevin leaned back in his chair, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "You should open a restaurant, Elara. I swear, I'd pay good money for this." Tom, as usual, didn't say much, but he nodded his agreement. What they didn't know was that this meal was no ordinary dinner. The stew was laced with enchanted herbs, and the dessert, small, sugary cakes, were bound with spells. Every bite they took deepened their connection to Elara. With each swallow, they became more susceptible to her influence, their minds softening, their will bending ever so slightly. By the end of the night, they were laughing, carefree, unaware that something deep inside them had shifted, and so it continued. Over the next few weeks, Elara hosted more gatherings. She would bake, cook, and serve snacks and meals, all enchanted in ways that would subtly tie her friends to her. They began to rely on her more, seeking her advice, following her suggestions without question. Even when they didn't agree with her at first, they found themselves changing their minds after talking to her. Elara thrived in the power she held over them. It felt intoxicating, the way she could manipulate their thoughts with just a word or a meal. Her coursemates, once independent, slowly became extensions of her own will. But witchcraft is never without consequence. Late one night, Elara sat alone in her apartment, the dim glow of a candle flickering on the table beside her. She had recently returned from a secret meeting with her coven, a group of witches who practiced in the shadows of the university. They met once a week in the dense woods just beyond the campus, where no one could find them. These meetings were sacred, a place where witches like Elara could harness their power without fear of discovery. Tonight, the meeting had been tense. "You're playing with fire, Elara," one of the older witches had warned. "Binding others to your will is a dangerous game." Elara had brushed it off. "They're just my friends. It's harmless." But the warning lingered in her mind. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. She was confident in her abilities. She was careful, always ensuring that no one knew about the magic she used, or so she thought. It was a chilly October night when things began to unravel. Elara had planned another dinner party, this time with a larger group. She had expanded her circle of influence, and now more of her course mates were eager to spend time with her. The food was prepared, the apartment decorated with warm lights and a few candles to set the mood. The night started like any other. Laughter filled the room, and everyone was enjoying the food and drinks. But as the night wore on, Amelia, who had been one of the first to fall under Elara's influence, began acting strangely. Her eyes seemed distant, and she kept blinking as if trying to clear her vision. "Amelia, are you okay?" Elara asked, her voice steady but her heart racing. Amelia looked at her, confused. I feel strange." The room grew quiet as everyone turned their attention to Amelia. Elara's pulse quickened. This wasn't part of the plan. Amelia wasn't supposed to react this way. "I'm fine," Amelia said quickly, standing up from her chair. "I just need some air." She hurried out of the apartment, leaving the others in an awkward silence. Elara's mind raced. Something was wrong. She hadn't used any stronger spells than usual. Could it be that Amelia was starting to break free of the enchantment? "I'll go check on her," Kevin offered, standing up. Elara nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Kevin." But as soon as the door closed behind him, Elara felt a cold chill run down her spine. She knew deep down that something was slipping out of her control. The next day, Amelia didn't show up for class. Neither did Kevin. Elara's anxiety grew. She tried to reach out to them, but neither of them answered their phones. By the evening, she was pacing in her apartment, her thoughts spiraling. What if they knew? What if the enchantments had worn off? It wasn't until the sun had set that she received a message. Not from Amelia or Kevin, but from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet us at the woods, now." Elara's stomach dropped. She knew exactly who it was. The Coven. They had warned her, and now they were calling her to face the consequences. Without a second thought, Elara grabbed her coat and hurried out into the night. The woods were a short walk from the campus, but each step felt heavier than the last. The air was cold, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. When she arrived at the clearing, she saw them, the Coven, standing in a circle, their faces shadowed by the moonlight. Amelia and Kevin stood in the center, their expressions blank, their eyes wide and unfocused. "What did you do to them?" Elara demanded, her voice shaking. The leader of the Coven, an older woman with silver hair, stepped forward. "You've gone too far, Elara. You've broken the balance." "I didn't mean to," Elara said quickly. "It was just a little influence. I wasn't hurting anyone." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You've used your powers carelessly. You've crossed a line that should never be crossed." Elara's heart pounded in her chest. "I can fix this. Just tell me what to do." The leader shook her head. "It's too late. They're bound to you now in ways that can't be undone." Panic surged through Elara. She looked at Amelia and Kevin, their blank stares haunting her. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The Coven leader raised her hand, and the air around them seemed to thicken. "You must be held accountable for your actions, Elara." Before Elara could react, a force slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. She gasped for breath as an invisible weight pressed down on her chest, pinning her to the cold earth. The Coven began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, filling the clearing with an eerie hum. Elara struggled, her mind racing. She had always been in control, always the one with the power. But now, she was helpless, at the mercy of those she had once thought were her allies. The chanting grew louder, and the pressure on Elara's chest intensified. She felt her connection to Amelia and Kevin slipping away, the bond she had created unraveling before her eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The weight lifted, and Elara gasped for air, her body trembling. The Coven leader stepped forward, her eyes cold and unforgiving. "You are no longer one of us, Elara." Elara's heart raced as she pushed herself up from the ground, still gasping for breath. She could feel it. Something had been taken from her, something deep and powerful. Her connection to the Coven, her source of strength, had been severed. She looked up at the leader, her voice trembling. What have you done to me?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. The leader's expression remained impassive. "You've been cast out. Your magic will no longer work the way it used to. You're on your own now. You've abused the gifts we trusted you with, and there are consequences for that." Elara's head spun. The weight of what she'd lost hit her all at once. Her powers had been her everything, the very thing that made her who she was. Without them, what was she? Who was she? "I was trying to help them," Elara said, her voice shaking with desperation. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "Intentions don't matter," the leader said coldly. "Your actions did, and now you'll have to face the consequences alone." Elara glanced at Amelia and Kevin, who were still standing motionless, their eyes empty and hollow. Her stomach twisted with guilt. She had done this to them. She had taken away their free will, manipulated their minds for her own selfish desires. And now she was paying the price. "Please," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is there any way to undo this? To fix them?" The leader shook her head. "It's not that simple. What you've done has left a mark on their souls. They may recover in time, or they may not. That's no longer up to you." With that, the coven turned and began to walk away, their figures disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Elara was left standing in the clearing, the cold wind biting at her skin, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and regret. Amelia and Kevin remained where they were, still dazed and unresponsive. Elara swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. She had to find a way to help them, to make things right. But where would she even start? Without the coven, without her full powers, she was more alone than ever. Over the next few days, the campus seemed to close in around her. Elara could feel the walls tightening, the whispers growing louder. Amelia and Kevin had returned to class, but they weren't the same. They were quiet, distant, like shadows of their former selves. Their friends noticed. That night, Elara barely slept. She lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what she should do next. The coven had abandoned her powers were weakened, and her classmates were starting to turn against her. She was running out of options. The next morning, she decided to visit the library. There had to be something in the old witchcraft texts that could help her, some way to reverse what she had done. As she sat at a secluded table, flipping through ancient books filled with spells and incantations, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Someone was watching her. She glanced up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Amelia standing at the edge of the library, her eyes fixed on Elara. But there was something off about her. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cold, almost dead. She didn't say a word, just stood there, staring. Elara quickly looked back down at her book, her hands trembling. She knew that Amelia was under her influence, but seeing her like this, so empty and lifeless, made Alara's stomach churn with guilt. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "You can't run from this, Elara." Alara's head snapped up, and she saw the coven leader standing behind Amelia, her face shadowed by the dim light of the library. Alara's blood turned to ice. "You've already crossed the line," the leader said, her voice low and menacing. "There's no going back now." Alara's mind raced. She had to get out of here. She had to find a way to fix this before it was too late. But as she stood to leave, the leader stepped forward, blocking her path. "You think you can fix this on your own?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can undo the damage you've caused?" Elara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I have to try," she whispered. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You're a fool, Elara. You don't understand the power you've been playing with. You've opened a door that can't be closed." Before Elara could respond, the leader raised her hand, and the air around them seemed to ripple with dark energy. Elara felt a force pull at her, dragging her down, suffocating her. "You've lost everything, Elara," the leader whispered, "and soon everyone will know what you are." Elara gasped for breath as the darkness closed in around her. The weight of her mistakes pressed down on her, crushing her, suffocating her. She had thought she was in control, but now she realized just how wrong she had been. The next morning, the entire campus was buzzing with whispers. People were talking about Amelia and Kevin, about the strange behavior of Elara's friends, and about the odd, unexplainable things that had been happening around her. The rumors were spreading like wildfire, and Elara knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. She had to act fast. With her powers weakened and the coven against her, Elara knew she couldn't rely on magic to fix this. She had to confess. It was the only way to stop the spiral before it destroyed her completely. That evening, Elara gathered her closest friends, Amelia, Kevin, and Tom, and brought them to her apartment. She knew that once she told them the truth, everything would change. They would hate her, they would fear her, but it was better than living with the guilt of what she had done. When they were all seated, Elara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I have to tell you something," she began, her voice shaking. "Something that I've been hiding from you all along." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Amelia, Kevin, and Tom watched Elara, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. Elara swallowed hard, her heart racing. She knew there was no turning back from this moment. Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. "I'm not like other people," Elara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a witch." For a moment, the silence was deafening. Amelia blinked, her expression unreadable. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at Tom, who remained stoic, his eyes fixed on Elara. "A witch?" Kevin finally broke the silence, his voice laced with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Elara took a deep breath and forced herself to continue. "I've been using magic on all of you. Not just simple spells, but powerful ones. Ones that have affected your minds, your thoughts, your will. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I just wanted to help, to make things easier for all of us." Tom's face darkened as he stood, his eyes burning with anger. "You controlled us?" Elara flinched. "It wasn't like that, not at first. It was subtle, just a way to make things smoother, to help you feel more comfortable around me, to make life a little easier. But I lost control. The magic grew stronger, and I started manipulating you without even realizing how far it had gone." Amelia's voice was soft, almost robotic, as she asked, "What did you do to me?" Elara's throat tightened as guilt crashed over her. She looked at Amelia, her friend's face pale and distant, and knew she had gone too far. "I bound you to me," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I used enchanted food, charms, and I connected your mind to mine. I didn't think it would affect you so deeply, but it has. I can see it in your eyes, Amelia. I'm so sorry." Amelia's face remained blank for a moment, then she stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "You controlled me? You messed with my mind? I trusted you, Elara." Her voice cracked, and she turned away, tears welling in her eyes. Kevin ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room as he struggled to process what he had just heard. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "How could you? You were supposed to be our friend, Elara. What gives you the right to mess with our lives like this?" Elara's voice broke, her emotions spilling over. "I didn't mean to. I swear I never wanted to hurt anyone. I thought I was helping, but the magic, it's dangerous. It's taken over, and I've lost control." Tom's fists clenched as he glared at Elara. "You've been playing God with our minds. How can you possibly justify that?" "I can't," Elara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't justify it. I was wrong. I've been selfish, and I've hurt you all. I know you'll never forgive me, but I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the truth, and I want to make it right." "Make it right?" Amelia's voice cracked as she turned to face Elara, her eyes brimming with anger and sadness. "How can you possibly fix this? You've ruined everything. How do we even know what's real anymore?" "I'll undo the magic," Elara promised, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'll remove the bindings, release the spells, everything. You'll be free, and I'll leave Havenbrook. I'll make sure no one ever has to deal with me or my magic again." Kevin looked at Elara with a mix of pity and disbelief. "And what happens to us after that? How do we move on, knowing what you did to us?" Elara shook her head, her voice hollow. "I don't know. I can't undo what's been done, but I can at least make sure the magic doesn't affect you anymore. I'll break the ties tonight, and after that, I'll leave. You'll never have to see me again." The room was heavy with silence once more as Elara's friends processed her words. She could see the pain and betrayal in their eyes, and it tore at her. But she knew this was the only way forward, the only way to give them a chance to reclaim their lives. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice cold and distant. "You're right about one thing. We'll never forgive you for this." Elara nodded, her heart breaking. "I understand." Amelia wiped her eyes, her voice trembling with emotion. Just undo whatever it is you did. I don't want to feel like this anymore." "I will," Elara said softly. "I'll undo it all." That night, Elara returned to the woods, the place where she had first met with the coven. where she had first tapped into the deeper, darker aspects of her power. The wind howled through the trees as she stood in the center of the clearing, the moon casting an eerie glow over the forest. Elara had brought with her the ingredients she needed, the herbs, the symbols, the candles, to break the ties she had created. She knew that this ritual would leave her even weaker than before. Without the coven's support, without the power she had once wielded, she would be left vulnerable. But it didn't matter anymore. She had already lost the trust of her friends. This was all she could do to make things right. As she arranged the candles in a circle around her, she began to chant, her voice low and steady. The wind whipped through the trees, and the air seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. She could feel the magic stirring, the ties she had bound to Amelia, Kevin, Tom, all of them, starting to unravel. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and the candles flickered wildly as the ritual reached its peak. Elara's heart pounded in her chest as the magic surged around her, pulling at the bonds she had created. And then, with a final breath, she released it. The air grew still, the candles went out, and Elara collapsed to her knees, exhausted. She could feel it. Her power had diminished even further, the connection she had once held over her friends now gone. They were free. But as she knelt there, alone in the dark, Elara couldn't shake the hollow feeling inside her. She had done what she could to make amends, but she knew that it wasn't enough. She had lost her friends, her magic, and her place in the world. For a long time, she remained in the clearing, the silence of the forest pressing in on her from all sides. She didn't know what she would do next. She didn't know where she would go. All she knew was that she could never return to the life she had known. The next day, the news of Elara has spread across the university. Elara was invited by the school board. As she walked to the office, students started mocking and calling her names. When she re-entered the hall where the school board were seated, the board handed a letter of dismissal to her. She was to leave the school with immediate effect. That was how Elara was dismissed from the university. As she walked out of the hostel with her luggages, angry students could be seen waiting to give her the beating of her life. But the school security protected her till she left the school premises. Elara grew old without a husband or even a child. The people who heard her story never came close to her anymore, even though she had repented. This is the story of Elara the Witch. Subscribe for more.